So I'm here in Naples, Florida at the Shangri-La Resort, and I'm with Sayer G.
All right.
Man, what a pleasure to interview you today.
Hey, it's great to be here, see you in person.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following your work for a long time, and so it's great to finally meet you face to face.
Same here.
And really looking forward to getting your take on a lot of these serious issues surrounding cancer today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's start off. I want to talk to you about chemo and radiation resistance.
Yes. I feel the word itself is almost like a euphemism for something really terrible, which is that when you are exposed to radiation that's based on gamma radiation, it's basically ionizing, it will cause damage to whatever basic tissue it's being exposed to. So in the same way, chemotherapy is also designed to be genotoxic. So you're trying to target fast replicating cells. And so by doing so, it is by definition also carcinogenic. And so really when we talk about resistance to chemo and radiation, it's really just a way of blaming the victim, because we're all, when exposed to conventional chemo and radiation, going to be harmed, and it is actually going to have a carcinogenic effect, and it will often cause secondary cancers. So technically, I think people need to be aware that this isn't truly a cancer therapy. At best, it's palliative in the sense that it might shrink a tumor, but what really the main thing I would like to get across is that it's going to cause an enrichment of the actual mother cell that's beneath the tumor, which is known as the cancer stem cell. So technically you are shrinking the tumor size, but you're enriching the population of the tumorigenic cells at the very same moment. So again, the idea that some people are resistant to chemo and radiation is really a false concept. Everyone exposed to radiation and chemo will have secondary adverse effects, some of which are worse than the original condition they're being treated for.
So Sayer, talk to us about different cells in the bodies that are also fast dividing.
Yes.
We know that cancer cells are fast dividing.
Yes.
That's one of the theories of chemotherapy, is that it hits fast dividing cells, which are cancer.
Yeah.
But are there other cells in the body that also are fast dividing?
It's a great question. See, basically our condition in modern times is we're exposed to so many sources of inflammation. And there is a very compelling theory that cancer essentially starts in many cases with unregulated inflammation. So if we're constantly being hit by toxins, infectious agents, chemicals, what will happen is the cells will be forced to repair themselves. And that's going to require inflammation to occur, which actually involves proliferative natural chemicals. And so if there's constant frustrated inflammation, the healing's not taking place, let's say we're smoking daily, or we're doing things that are constantly causing injury, that will cause those cells to replicate more rapidly. And so over time, in many ways, the cancer is a frustrated, unresolved inflammatory response that will eventually emerge into a cancerous phenotype. So in many ways,
What's a phenotype?
A phenotype is just a cell changing from its intended purpose. So if I'm a hair or a heart or a skin cell, after being beaten down by all these unnatural modern exposures, I'm trying to adapt, so I'm actually becoming a different type of cell to adjust to those conditions, and that type of cell is going to look a lot like a cancer cell.
Okay. Now, are you talking about stem cells? Because those are the ones that can become anything, right?
Yes.
Stem cells.
Yes, cancer stem cells are actually a dysregulated or a misinformed normal stem cell that is basically now proliferating wildly, not aware of its role in the whole of the multicellular organism. It's gone rogue, basically, but again, not for reasons that aren't logical, because it's trying to adjust to a very toxic environment. So those cells will start to try to invade other tissues, and they do their own thing. But yes, the cancer stem cell ultimately does come from a normal cell that its job is to keep repairing the daughter cells that have been damaged and keeping on healing the body.
And so really, when we're talking about chemotherapy, we're talking about a substance that targets cancer cells, but not the stem cells, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, the idea behind a lot of the at least genotoxic chemotherapies, which are really poisons. In fact, some of them actually originate, as you know, from the war theater as sort of chemical weapons. And so even today, there are forms that are derived from that lineage. And so they just destroy any fast replicating cell, because when a cell's replicating in mitosis, its DNA is exposed, perfect time for it to be genotoxic, and in theory kill the cell. Unfortunately though, the cancer stem cells are resistant to chemotoxic agents, and so technically those cells survive when all of the daughter cells that are in the tumor Again, tumors are not cancer, they're different, and they don't themselves have the ability to go out and invade and kill the patient. They do cause problems over time because they can obstruct normal biological processes. But so the idea is that the cancer stem cell will basically be enriched when you use chemotherapy, and that ultimately puts the clinician, the oncologist is saying, oh my gosh, we're winning. We've just beat back the tumor. It's smaller. In fact, you might even beat it back below the threshold of surveillance. But ultimately, if you look at what's happened, is there's been an enrichment of the cancer stem cell. And the cancer stem cell might be 1 in every 10,000 cells within a tumor. And it's erected like a hierarchy. At the apex is the cancer stem cell. The mother produces all the daughter cells, all the differentiated roles. But unless you target the cancer stem cell, it'll just keep coming back. And the thing about it is because of the way that the cancer practice and industry really looks at the 5-year survival rate, is that they may, quote, treat somebody, give them chemo, radiation, see the tumor regress, go into remission, and then 5 years and 2 months later, when they get another cancer, they can just define it as a new cancer and not look at the root of it, which is that it was just the subpopulation of cancer stem cells that were not only resistant to chemo and radiation, but were enriched, that then grew back slowly over time, because as you know, right, a tumor or a cancer could take decades before you actually can get it to be surveilled. So that's sort of just like an antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You have an infection, you take this chemical, which is in the category actually of a chemotherapy, antibiotics generally, and you whack back 99.9% of the infection, of course with all the good bacteria, and then that 0.1% is now building out this biofilm, it's sitting there in dormancy, and it's resistant now to that chemical. So you have to come back with even more toxic chemicals when it comes back. Before you know it, obviously the host immune system's dead, you've poisoned the body, and now you have this highly resistant, antibiotic resistant, chemical resistant bacteria. It's the same with cancer.
Name a few cells in the body that are also fast dividing as well as the cancer cells.
Fast dividing tissue in the body, when you look at it, things like hair follicle cells are very fast dividing, which is one reason why chemo often causes hair loss. There's intestinal cells that will divide so rapidly that every 3 days you have a new intestinal lining. So a lot of the tissues that are susceptible to adverse effects from chemo and radiation are going to be, those that are constantly having to regenerate. And because when you really look at cancer, it is really a regenerative process in our body that is thwarted and misguided. And ultimately, when you think about cancer, I mean, it is impossible to kill. It's like a sort of a metaphor for eternal life and indestructibility and resilience of life versus chemicals. The problem, of course, is that it's about the microenvironment of the, quote, cancer cell. We have to adjust and change things back, detoxify, we need to supplement with the right nutrition and information from the right foods, hydrate, oxygenate. Those are all the factors that will then re-educate that cell to say, oh, wait a second, I'm supposed to do this particular job as a hair cell, this job as a heart cell. I'm not going to go become a cancer and try to take over the whole body.
Right, right. Are there certain herbs and supplements that you can take that will target those stem cells that are the real boogers?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a term that is used in the research community in this arena called selective cytotoxicity, which means that, you could take bleach, obviously, and expose a cancer cell to it, it's going to die. So when you use herbs sometimes in the cell or the, sort of petri dish model, it makes everything look pretty good. But the difference is that when you take a herb like turmeric and you take a compound out of it like polyphenol-rich curcumin, it'll actually kill the cancer cell, but then you have healthy normal cells there, it'll leave them intact. In fact, in some cases, it'll have a cytoprotective or cell protective effect. So it's intelligent in the sense that it can target the cancer stem cell and leave other cells that are either tumorous and will never cause harm or are natural, healthy cells and totally protect them from damage.
So turmeric was one.
Turmeric is probably the most heavily researched anti-cancer agent which has the ability to selectively target the root of the cancer, which again, cancer stem cells, and then leave intact the healthy tissue. But you have other substances such as resveratrol, green tea, quercetin found in onions and other herbs, sulforaphane from cruciferous vegetables, especially broccoli sprouts. These are the heavy hitters that I'm sure you know a lot about.
Yeah, the reason I'm smiling and chuckling a little bit is that we did a recent interview with Dr. David Jockers.
Ah, yes.
And he mentioned those same exact
Oh,
herbs,
yeah.
but not for this reason, but for other reasons.
Ah, yes.
But they're different ways that they all hit cancer cells.
It's remarkable because what really this category is often polyphenol category. And so things like catechin in green tea, resveratrol from red grapes, even peanuts, and curcumin from turmeric. Actually, that category of compounds is produced by plants when they're under stress. And it turns out that organic plants are the only ones that produce these really in any significant amount, because they're not basically having pesticides to take care of their pests and petroleum-derived fertilizer to boost their growth. They have to survive the elements like us, so they've developed the strong chemistries to protect them. When we consume those compounds, they activate longevity pathways within our body, similar to what caloric restriction does in fasting, as well as activate things like anti-cancer mechanisms within the cell. So it's almost like this poetry of positive codependency between the plants we've evolved to consume, and then of course our body's needs. We sort of depend on each other and help each other.
It's really fascinating. One of the things you mentioned I've never thought about is the fact that plants and vegetables, fruits that are being sprayed with pesticides, since they're being sprayed with pesticides, they don't have that reaction to pests, which protects them, and so then we don't have that compound or those compounds that we ingest.
Exactly.
I was interviewing Dr. Patrick Quillen, who's written a book, Beating Cancer with Nutrition. It was last year, and he was talking about several compounds that plants produce to protect themselves from pests that then benefit us. And I never put that together, that the plants that are being sprayed with pesticides, they don't have those. Yeah,
in some cases, organically produced produce will have 100 times higher polyphenols. So when you look at the ultimate price you're paying, maybe it's 50% more for organic, but you're getting 100 times more value as an anti-cancer nutrient, it's clearly a better value. Especially since when you price cancer, you're talking about $1 million, right, and financial bankruptcy, not to mention all of the suffering that it causes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned earlier, Sarah, was about if you live 5 years and 2 days or 2 months or whatever, and then they may call it another cancer. Talk a little bit about the way that statistics are skewed, right? Because let's say you have somebody that's diagnosed, they have breast cancer, and they douse it with chemotherapy, the tumor shrinks, it's not detectable, they live 5 years and a month, and then they diagnose them with another type of cancer. That's considered to be a cured person now.
Exactly. I mean, in terms of the way that there's been a manipulation of the science, and there's been a very dangerous thing called overdiagnosis that has really afflicted millions of women over the past 30 years, especially for breast cancer. Because what they've done is that they convinced women that if they were to basically subscribe to an X-ray mammography screening, even though they have no symptoms, that ultimately that would help them in the long run. They'd have a lower risk of cancer because they'd find it early.
Early detection is your best protection.
Exactly. They even equated this meme with prevention, when in fact you're exposing your breast to a type of radiation that is actually known to have a higher risk of causing cancer in the breast, especially if you have the BRCA1 and 2 gene mutations that everyone is so concerned about, because they make it harder for you to to protect yourself from radiation-induced damage. So overdiagnosis, according to a recent study done in the New England Journal of Medicine, over the past 30 years in the United States resulted in 1.3 million women being diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer that technically never had any type of cancer that would have caused harm. This is called ductal carcinoma in situ, or stage 0 cancer, which they equated with actual cancer, which now we know is not. And so what that basically meant is that they would give them the standard mastectomy or lumpectomy with radiation, with chemotherapy, things like tamoxifen, and then follow up hormone suppressive therapies like Arimidex. So basically what we're dealing with here is a kind of a medical holocaust of sorts, because those women now had to deal with being diagnosed with a cancer they didn't have, being treated for it, having the stigma and all the psycho-spiritual emotional stress that's caused by that. And then statistically, the industry told them that they saved their lives, when in fact quite the opposite had happened. So they identify with the aggressor like a Stockholm syndrome, and millions of people march in these breast cancer awareness marches, not realizing that it's funded by the very corporations that make money off the drugs used to treat breast cancer. We're talking about AstraZeneca, which actually is a derivative of Imperial Chemical Industries, who started breast cancer awareness months and has a patent, or had the patent, for tamoxifen and Arimidex.